Welcome, everyone, to the English podcast, Voice of Christians, a platform for relevant and intelligent conversations. I am Peter Costea, your host for this podcast tonight, and I want to thank you very much for joining in. As always, we would like to ask you to um, share and to comment and to distribute and to subscribe also to our English YouTube channel here on Voice of Christians. We'd like to be of help and of assistance to you. In keeping with our commitments to bring to you relevant topics, intelligent topics, and discussions, for tonight we have been able to obtain the presence and the formidable guest who is going to discuss with us today a very important topic for the UK, for Europe, and actually for the whole Western world, and that is the issue of Islam. We are going to focus mostly on Islam in the United Kingdom and the challenges which Islam is posing to Christian culture in general, to the UK, and also to some extent to Europe. And we are going to have this discussion with the author of a formidable book which just came out. The title of the book is The Challenge of Islam in the UK, and the name of the author is Tim Dieppe, whom I welcome very much and wholeheartedly and warmly to this podcast. Tim, good evening in London, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Pleasure to come on.
Yes, thank you very much. I also want to remind the audience that this is not going to be a rapid fire discussion or interview like you typically see on television, because again, the topic and the subject is very important, and we need to understand the topic very well, and we are going to allow our guest to present his main themes and whatever he has learned in reading, studying about this topic, and obviously living in a European country and a major world city where Islam is very, very influential. So, Tim, what I would like to ask you to do for right now is tell us a few things about yourself, and then we'll get into the substance of our conversation.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you. What to say? I worked in finance for some time as a fund manager in the city in London, managing global funds on the stock markets of the world. And what sort of really sparked my interest in Islam was watching 9/11 happen, actually, the attacks in 2001 on the Twin Towers. And I'd heard of suicide bombers at that time, but I assumed that they must be poor, illiterate, easily manipulable people. And here were obviously highly trained, well-educated, well-paid pilots who were doing this. We knew immediately that it wasn't a hijack, because no hijacked pilot, even with a gun to their head, is going to drive into the Twin Towers, fly into the Twin Towers. So I was like, wow, what is this worldview that can motivate people to have such disregard for human life? And that's what set me on a train, really, of studying Islam and reading about Islam, learning about Islam, and trying to understand it. And I became more concerned about what I learnt and started praying for opportunity to share and explain to people the kind of things that I'd learnt. And then I came across Islamic finance, and I thought, gosh, I work in finance, I ought to understand Islamic finance. So I researched Islamic finance and found that it's based on a modern, radical interpretation of the Quran. Most Muslims throughout history and still today are very happy to borrow and lend with interest, but the radical interpretation is that the Quran forbids interest altogether, and so they have alternative systems. They, instead of calling it interest, they call it rent, and have a slightly different legal structure and so on. This is all designed to create a rival financial system and to legitimize Sharia law more generally, and all of that kind of thing. And it is fueled by radicalism, really. And so it's extraordinary that it's been bought into by Western institutions and Western governments. And I found that there was a book published in English by a man called Taqi Usmani, who was then chairman of HSBC Sharia Advisory, also on multiple advisory boards around the world. And in this book, he asks a hypothetical question. He says, do we still need to wear jihad in a country like Britain, where we can freely build mosques and preach Islam? And he answers the question by saying, according to the Quran, killing should continue until we pay the jizya tax. Now, the jizya tax is the subjugation tax for non-Muslims in Islamic Caliphate or Islamic State. So that sort of made me realise, my goodness, this chap is a full-on radical Muslim. He wants full Sharia law, full discrimination between Muslims and non-Muslims, a poll tax on all non-Muslims who don't submit to the will of Islam. And I was like, this is really the agenda behind all of this Sharia finance stuff. So I wrote to a friend at HSBC and said, do you really think this chap should be on your advisory board? He passed that email on to compliance, and compliance panicked and sacked the chap from the board. They left his son on that advisory board and all the other imams who I'm sure at least knew and probably sympathised with his views. 5 years later, they did close it down. But the point is, it opened my eyes to what is really behind Sharia finance. It's about legitimising Sharia law more generally. If you legitimise Sharia finance, then it's hard to criticise Sharia family law if you've said you welcome Sharia finance, for example. So that sort of got me interested, and all my colleagues knew about this. And then as I was praying for opportunities to talk about Islam, the answer to prayer I got was not what I wanted. I was asked to run a Sharia fund, and it would have been my name, Tim Dieppe, manager of a Sharia fund. And I had to say, no, I don't want to do that. And not only do I not want to do that, I think we shouldn't do it as a firm for these various reasons. I tried to explain it to my colleagues and ran into some problems with that. And nobody agreed with me, basically. So I reached out for help and connected with Christian Concern. And that began a sort of new relationship with Christian Concern, which developed, and I started working behind the scenes with Christian Concern for a bit on parliamentary advice and things like that. And then I started working for them back in 2016. So it's nearly 10 years now that I've been working for Christian Concern, focused on Islam. I'm head of public policy now, so I do look at other things as well, but I try and retain a specialism on Islam. And this year, as you said, we published this book, The Challenge of Islam, which is really a collection of my writings on Islam and tries to explain a lot of what I've learned about Islam and a lot of stuff that I've been saying about Islam and how Islam poses a cultural challenge, I think, really, to the nation and to the West more generally. So there's a brief introduction.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. 9/11 has changed the optics for many, many of us. I do remember very well where I was on 9/11 when those events happened. I think that probably even billions of people on the planet have been marked, maybe irreversibly, with respect to their views of Islam, either good or bad, after those events on 9/11. And you're right about intelligent people, young people, professional people, pilots, people making a lot of money, that you were wondering, as I was back 20-something years ago, how people, highly educated can engage in such terrible, terrible conduct, people for whom destroying human lives would be the supreme accomplishment, if you will. One of the other things that we would like to learn about you, Tim, is you mentioned a short while ago that you are also connected with an organization, mostly online, that I am aware of and that I follow closely, and I have followed, I would say, weekly for at least 10 years, is Christian Concern. Could you please tell us about this platform? You said you've been associated with Christian Concerns in 2016. So tell us about Christian Concerns, what they do.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that you're director of policy. Tell us a few things about this great organization in the UK.
Yes, thank you. Well, Christian Concern is really an organization that tries to be a voice for Christians, or a voice for the church, or a voice for Jesus in the public square. So we seek to sort of advocate for a Christian perspective on what's happening in our culture, whether it's in law, whether it's in media, whether it's in government, whether it's in the church, and to equip Christians to understand what's happening in our culture from a Christian perspective. We're most well known for our legal cases. We've had lots of very high profile cases, some of which have been to the High Court and the Supreme Court. The Darlington nurses case is very well known over here, where some nurses were forced to get changed in front of a man who now says he's a woman, even though he also says he's trying to impregnate his girlfriend. And these nurses complained, and they were told they're transphobic and so on for not wanting to get dressed in front of a man in their changing room. And we've defended lots of street preachers and various other people who've got into problems because of their faith. Another famous case is Christy Higgs, who worked at a school pastoral assistant and posted on Facebook concerns about extreme sex education in primary schools. And she was reported to the school by somebody and then sacked for gross misconduct. We won her case after some years in the Court of Appeal, and it's a very significant free speech case that has implications and repercussions for a lot of other people, that you can say what you think on Facebook without fear of losing your job. And lots of other people like that. And we also go in the media. I've been on radio and television here, various things, and podcasts like this and so on. And we also, try and speak in the public square and write articles and do interviews and talk about the Christian perspective on things. We're campaigning on various issues. At the moment, there's a assisted suicide law going through our parliament, so we're very active, engaged on that, and trying to explain why we think that's a bad idea to bring into law. We've also campaigned on abortion and on the whole LGBT agenda and on education and having Christian values in education and setting up Christian schools, as well as on Islam and on secularism. And we respond to government consultations as well, and lobby parliamentarians as well, and write briefings for parliamentarians and all of that kind of thing.
So you do a lot of things. I have also known a number of people that have worked with Christian Concern in the past. Roger Kiska was a very good friend of mine. Actually, he still is. He has done tremendous work for you guys for a while. And I would encourage everyone that's listening or is watching this podcast, or you might in the future, folks, I encourage you very much to subscribe to Christian Concern. You're going to be blessed every Friday afternoon. You're going to get into your inbox. You're going to get a fantastic newsletter in which you're going to get a lot of details about the fight, the tremendous good fight that UK Christians are engaged in the United Kingdom under very hostile circumstances. You'll get the details about, just like Tim said, about preachers being arrested or harassed for preaching the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ out in the public square. You will get news about legislative attempts to reduce or to restrict Christian values and Christian freedoms in the UK as well. And also, Tim, Christian Concern does a lot of conferences. Folks, do go to those conferences. I haven't been to one yet, but I can tell you from looking at the agendas, the structure, the speakers that are invited to speak at these conferences, you will get a lot of value, a lot of information, useful, accurate information about what's going on in the UK, and not only in the UK, but throughout the world, concerning the values which are so dear to you and to I. Another thing that I want to mention, Tim, which I appreciate very much as Christian Concern, is that you have lots and lots of programs for young people. And it's amazing how many young faces I see on your podcasts, on your Instagram, and in whatever activities you're engaged in. A lot of young people that seem to be on fire for Christ, and that is a good sign. Getting back to our topic.
Just thank you very much for that. But just to say, in order to get that free weekly email, just go to christianconcern.com/hello, and you can just fill in your details and subscribe to that free weekly email that gives you all of that information. And yes, we do run a Wilberforce Academy, which is a week-long intensive training program for young people in September. And just Google Wilberforce Academy and you'll find it. And applications are open now for September next year.
Outstanding. And in case you didn't catch or didn't get the website disclosed by Tim, go ahead and just Google Christian Concern. You're going to get there very easily by Googling Christian Concern, and you will get all the details that you need. And again, I stress, and by the way, another thing that I like about Christian Concern, Team, is that almost every week you have some sort of a petition. I have signed as many petitions as I could. The problem is that since I live in the United States, most of the time, 99.99% of the time, I cannot sign all of the petitions because some of them are restricted to UK residents. So getting back to our conversation, the topic of our conversation, I think it would be of great interest for our viewers to sort of, and for myself as well, to sort of get an idea, some statistical data about the presence of Muslims in the UK, like about how many Muslims there are in the UK right now.
Yeah.
When they started coming into the UK in great numbers, where the numbers are right now, and what we might expect in terms of the percentage of the population, UK population, or the number of Muslims in the UK, maybe 10, 20 years from now. What are the trends, in other words?
Yes, so we last had a census in 2021, and at that census they said there's about 3.9 million Muslims in the UK, and that's about 6.5% of the population. It's grown since then, so it's certainly be about 7%, maybe more than 7% by now of the population, and that's the ones that, of course, we know about from the census. That people that come in illegally and aren't registered wouldn't necessarily be counted in that. That's grown from, I think, 2 million about 10 years before that, and a million about 10 years before that, and only 100,000 going back to about 1960 or so. So it's been rapid growth in the last 20 years in particular, 30 years as well, and mainly by immigration. The growth has come. There has been some also by having more children than the average family in the UK, and also by some conversion as well. But it's mainly been immigration that has caused this rapid growth in the UK, and immigration has now become a very hot topic. In fact, now the most significant topic that people are prepared to vote on is immigration, because of concern about this Islamisation. Now, 7% might not sound like very much, but think about LGBT and that whole influence on society. That's about 2% maximum of the population, and they managed to change the definition of marriage. So 7% is a much bigger portion than that, and they're more determined than many people and more assertive than many people in terms of their demands on our culture. But the other thing is they're very concentrated in certain areas. So some areas of the country you'll find very few to no Muslims at all, whereas in major cities like Birmingham it's 30% of the population, and so parts of Birmingham would be 90% plus of the population. Same would apply in other big towns like Bradford and what was I going to say? Maybe Manchester and parts of London, Tower Hamlets, and various other towns as well, Dewsbury in Yorkshire as well, where there's a huge portion of Muslims in the whole town. It's about 30%. In certain areas, it would be 90% plus. And so in certain areas of the country, it's very Islamic. And so then in those areas, you're almost walking into a different culture. You can see photographs and visit and see places where all the men are dressed in Islamic garb, all the women are covered up, at least with a hijab, if not with a burqa, and the shops are all selling halal food, and the signposts are all in Arabic, and you feel like you're in a completely different culture in those places of Birmingham or London, or other places in the UK. So, and even Muslim commentators will say some areas are no-go areas for non-Muslims in terms of if you want to be safe. So it's and it is growing. It's continuing to grow at the moment because immigration is continuing, and on your current projections by 2050 there'll be more and more places, and starting to have an impact on the ballot box as well. And just to elaborate on that, last year we had a general election here, and for the first time we had a concerted campaign by a group called the Muslim Vote that was endorsing certain candidates and backing some independent candidates for the election. And there are, I can't remember how many seats, but something like over 100 seats with 10% of the population Muslim now. There are some seats with over 50% of the population being Muslim, so it's basically controlled by the Muslim Vote. Most seats, the tip between winning and losing is 10%. So if you shift it one way or another, you could argue the Muslims can tip a large portion of the seats in Parliament. The Muslim Vote themselves, after the election, claimed that 50 candidates they endorsed became MPs, members of Parliament. So that's 50 people who backed their demands, which include things like recognising the state of Palestine, which has happened, of course. Britain has recognised the state of Palestine, and in spite of no borders and all of the issues with that and so on, and demanding for a definition of Islamophobia, which we can come on to, and various other demands as well. And it wouldn't surprise me if by the next election we have an actual national political party that is Islamic. So this is influencing our culture by the ballot box, so to speak. And This is just one aspect of how things are going and where things are going in this country. Mohammed is the most popular boy's name in the country. Has been for about 15 years now, if you count spelling variations of Mohammed, which there are about 5 or 6. They're not spelling variations of Harry or George or that kind of thing, but Mohammed's, there's different spellings, and so it didn't look like it was the most popular name for some years, but actually it has been for quite a number of years now. And that's just indicative of the demographic change and shift that is happening in the UK.
Yeah, thank you. One of the themes that I encountered in your book, and which has been on one of the subjects of personal interest as well, especially after 9/11, we have this notion that Islam is a religion of peace.
Yeah,
And 9/11 comes around, you look at what happens in the Middle East, you look at what happens in Africa, and most of those conflicts really have nothing to do with Israelis. They don't have anything to do with Christians or Christianity.
mm,
Most of them are conflicts between various Muslim groups and Muslim tribes, if you will,
mm,
different Muslim, directions and dogmas and so on and so forth.
mm,
So, and of course, then it's not only 9/11, but we also recall what happened in, I think, Bakatlani in Paris a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago. But not only that, but if you look what happened in Kenya, Tanzania years
yeah,
ago, and then you see also
yeah,
churches being torched in Africa, in Timbuktu, for instance,
yeah,
and similar
yeah.
in Niger. So, what's your take? What's the view in your book about whether or not Islam is a religion of peace?
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book called "Is Islam a Religion of Peace?" And I asked the question. And first of all, we have to define what Islam is. So, you know, you could define it by what most Muslims believe, but I think that's reasonable because lots of people identify as Muslim without really understanding what Islam teaches. So I think you need to define Islam by the teaching of Muhammad in the Quran and the Hadith, and the example of Muhammad in terms of how he lived his life. Um, and this is, I'm not saying that all Muslims are violent or advocating violence, but I am saying that according to the teaching of Muhammad and the example of Muhammad, Islam is not a religion of peace. Muhammad founded the religion according to tradition. One can question the tradition, but that's the tradition that they believe. And when he was a minority in a small group, he did advocate peace and sort of try to negotiate things. When he became a stronger power and had more followers, he broke peace treaties and expanded by force and by warfare. And he participated in dozens of battles. He killed people, he took slaves, and so on. And there are multiple calls for jihad that is clearly intended to be violent jihad in the Quran. And Surah 9 is the most famous example. And it's got verses like, kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, and so on. And there are like something like 140 different violent verses in the Quran. And this is so according to this, Islam is not a peaceful religion. That's not to say again that most Muslims believe that or know that. A lot of Muslims are just cultural Muslims. They don't really know what the Quran teaches. They just go along to mosque and have fellowship with people around them who are lovely people, and so they believe Islam is a lovely religion. But increasingly, you can see on the internet what Islam actually teaches and read it on the internet. And you can Google my article, by the way, "Is Islam a Religion of Peace?" Just Google that, and my article will come up in the top 5 results or so, I expect. So it's been read by many, many thousands of people, and so I'm just hopefully people find it helpful explaining what Islam really teaches in terms of warfare and jihad and so on.
A related question would be, obviously, we are talking about what we call, or what has been designated as, the three Abrahamic religions, all of them somehow converging or claiming that Abraham is, in a sense, a spiritual father, Islam being one of those Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, and then Israel, obviously, and for obvious reasons. What about the relations between the Israelites uh, and the Hebrews and Judaism, I should say, and Islam? Is Islam an anti-Semitic faith?
Yes, I mean, I don't like to recognize Abrahamic religions because the conception of Abraham in Islam is very different to the conception of Abraham in the Bible. They believe Abraham was a Muslim. Makes no sense because Islam didn't start till AD 630 or something. But anyway, that is what they believe, and they have different beliefs about what Abraham was like. So I don't really recognize that conception. I do think also that Allah is not the same as the God of the Bible. Allah is not a Trinity. Allah is not a loving God and not necessarily a forgiving God, and all these things. It's not the same God as the God of the Bible. So, which is an important point to recognise and realise. But then the question is Islam anti-Semitic, which is another chapter in my book, is Islam anti-Semitic? I did a debate last year with an American professor, Reza Aslan, who has written a couple of New York Times best-selling books on religion and Islam and stuff. And the debate title is Islam anti-Semitic? And I sort of prayed about whether to do this debate and also took advice on it and decided that I should do it because the texts are so clear that all I really need to do is read the text. And I collect the text in the book and demonstrate this, that there are multiple verses in the Quran that are clearly anti-Semitic, describing Jews as apes and pigs and cursed forever and all of this kind of thing. And in the Hadith as well, and in the teaching of prominent Muslims throughout history. So Islamic teaching clearly is anti-Semitic. This is important to recognize because it's clearly a factor in the whole Arab-Israeli conflict and the Gaza conflicts and all of that. You do routinely often hear about imams preaching anti-Semitic stuff, and what people don't realize is they're just preaching what the Quran says. They're just repeating what the Quran says when they say some of this anti-Semitic stuff. So yes, it is unfortunately, sadly, very anti-Semitic in what you read in the Quran and in the Hadith and the tradition of Muhammad. And so that's a real issue and something else to recognize about the nature of Islam. And we're seeing massively increased anti-Semitism here in London and across the country. Mosques now have to pay for security. People to go. I don't mean mosques. I mean synagogues have to pay for security and have people outside them. There's one near me, and when on Friday nights and Saturdays they have security there. And you've seen demonstrations, pro-Gaza demonstrations where anti-Semitism is clearly on display. The chant from the river to the sea, Israel, Palestine shall be free, was projected onto our Parliament building with no repercussions that I'm aware of for anybody doing that, even though that's a clearly anti-Semitic genocidal chant as well. And Jews are routinely experiencing anti-Semitism because of Islam. This is the point that not many people are saying. It's because of the increased influence of Islam and prevalence of Islam and Muslims who are repeating and have accepted Islamic teaching in relation to the Jews.
You are correct. That's been my experience as well. I travel once in a while. Well, I used to, in my younger days, travel quite frequently on vacation to different Muslim countries, and I would purchase local books and read. And by the way, I do not know whether or not this has been your experience or not, but my experience has been that some of the books that I find in Niger or Mali or Egypt, in the local bookstores in English, about Christianity, about Judaism, for instance, they are very aggressive. They are very vulgar. They are very incisive, very anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, and it's amazing that you don't really find those books here in London or maybe Houston, where I live, and so on and so forth. But indeed,
Well, I think
Islamic
you will in the mosques. If you go into there's a moderate Muslim called Ed Hussein who wrote a book called Among the Mosques, and he went to all the biggest mosques in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Bradford, Glasgow, and so on. And he said every Islamic bookshop sells the kind of books that are banned in Saudi Arabia because they're teaching jihad and this kind of stuff. So every Islamic bookshop that he went to, he said you can find the kind of extremist Islamic literature that is banned in Saudi Arabia. That's a very powerful indication of where we are in our culture. Saudi Arabia understands the problem with radical Islam and tries to clamp down on it. With Britain, we're sort of naive and we think, oh, it's just a religion, we need to give them freedom of religion. And the idea of banning books is like, sounds very crazy to us. But then what do you have? Poisonous ideology being, freely distributed in the UK, which is not available in Saudi Arabia.
It's interesting you mentioned a book. I forgot the name of the author or the title of the book, but I do remember I did buy that book about 2 or 3 years ago when it came out. It's not that old of a book, and I have read it. And folks, it's an eye opener about what's happening in the UK, in London, Birmingham, Bradford. Those are places that you have mentioned already about the influence of Islam in those cities and neighborhoods in the United Kingdom. You also made a point to which I subscribe fully when I mentioned about the Abrahamic, so-called Abrahamic faith. That is what the media is giving us. It's a long story, but I agree with you. Allah is not the God of the Bible. There is no
Mm.
doubt in my mind about that, and I want to thank you, Tim, for having the courage to say that out loud in a podcast and maybe in other venues as well. Actually, I think that I have read about 10, 15 years ago a book also written by a British scholar. I forgot his name. I wish I could remember his name right now instantaneously, but I don't. It is a book about why Islam is a false religion. You don't get that in the media. You don't see anything written or published about that in The Guardian, for instance, The Independent, or even in the United States, the New York Times, or other publications as to Islam being a false religion. But I'm glad you mentioned that, and I appreciate your courage to say that in public as well. Let's move on to another topic. You talked about this topic right, I think, during the opening segment of our podcast about Islamic finance. I mentioned a
Yeah.
couple of times already that in my younger days I used to travel to Muslim countries, and I did hear this notion, Islamic finance, and I sort of lost track of the idea. So maybe you can refresh my recollection and tell all of us, for the benefit of those who don't know, what is Islamic finance and how it works, and also is it practiced in the UK?
Yes. So, as I sort of said in the introduction, it's based on this idea that the Quran prohibits interest. Most scholars throughout Islamic history have viewed the Quran as prohibiting usury or extortionate interest, as the Bible does, as Christians would agree. But this radical new interpretation is saying, which it only really started in the 1970s, so that's how new it is. It's less than 50 years old. Says that the Quran prohibits interest altogether, and so in order to get around this, I've seen an advert for an Islamic mortgage, and whereas a standard mortgage you'll have a variable interest rate or a fixed interest rate. On the Islamic mortgage advert, it says variable rent or fixed rent. And it's the same thing, but it's just called rent, and they just have a slightly different legal structure, a bit more complicated. In fact, it disadvantages Muslims because it is more complicated legal structure to get around this. And it's all just games, smoke and mirrors. At the end of the day, interest is at the back of it anyway, but they just call it rent, and in order to comply with this silly idea that we can't have interest. And actually, moderate Muslims don't like it. They're like, this is deceptive. It's not right. It's not the right interpretation either. And it's deceiving people about the true nature of it anyway. And all of this. But it's the more the radicals that are in favour of it. And yes, there are Islamic banks in Britain, and there are mainstream banks offering Islamic products as well. And Britain became the first non-Muslim country in the world to issue a government Sharia bond. I think it was in 2014. So we have now we have two. So there are two government bonds that are actually governed by Sharia law in an attempt to encourage Sharia finance in the UK. So the government and Western institutions are just blind to this, what they're really doing here, in sort of basically encouraging a radical modern interpretation of the Quran and a separate financial system, and system that has to be endorsed and signed off by Muslims as halal. And therefore you're funding, people to be on these advisory committees and so on, and people like Taki Osmani, who I mentioned earlier as well, to do this and so on. So it's crazy, really, that major Western financial institutions and governments have gone down this line of, oh gosh, we ought to facilitate Islamic finance. Let's create these special products for them, when this is playing into the radical interpretation, the radical aims of this whole thing. And you'd have thought that, you know, someone like Taki Usmani had written a book in English, like I described earlier, somebody who'd done some basic due diligence and thought, you know, let's not have him. But obviously that didn't take place. So yes, so it's an issue, and it's one that we need to wake up to and be alert to and recognise. And few people are pointing out the issues of Islamic finance, but there's a chapter on that in the book as well.
I'm curious because you have a background in finance, I have background in law. I'm an attorney, and from what I recall, I apologize, the state has to charter a bank. Am I wrong about that? If
The
the
state has
state is
to
the
do
one
what?
that, if the state actually charters a bank,
Yes.
are we to understand that in the UK the state is chartering these Islamic banks that function according to Islamic principles?
Yes, well, the Bank of England actually changed its rules to allow people to borrow from it without interest. I mean, calling it something else, but you know, they actually changed their rules specifically in order to facilitate Islamic banking. So yes, they're kind of, you do have to get a license or something to set up a bank and comply with various regulations, but they have, yes, made special provision for this to happen.
Again, folks, that shows you just how influential Islam has become in the UK, and I would imagine that now that the ice has been broken, there is no turning back. But we'll continue our conversation with Tim. Folks, don't forget to sign up and subscribe to our English YouTube channel and distribute this podcast. Comment if you'd like to, ask questions if you can. I actually do not see the comments on the side of the screen, but if in the event, Janina, we have relevant comments or questions, please go ahead and send them to me on WhatsApp, and we are going to communicate them on to our guest. Another topic, we have sort of touched on this topic as well in our conversation so far, but there's one label that's been in vogue for the last 20, 25 years, maybe 30 years in Europe. You have gotten, at least I have gotten tired of it, but it's coming up not as frequently as it used to, and that is multiculturalism, a doctrine which essentially says you can have two states within one state. It's the opposite of integration and the melting pot theory that we have in the United States. You know, a form of integration. I would imagine that multiculturalism is alive and well in the UK. How did this come about? What's wrong with multiculturalism?
Well, yes, multiculturalism was really advocated in about the 1990s or so as a kind of utopian dream that everyone can live together, even though we're all from different cultures and accept different values. But actually, you know, if you go too far with this, then you end up breaking social cohesion, because there are no values to which everyone adheres and no values to which everyone agrees to, and people are coming out from all sorts of different values, and it ultimately becomes a kind of polytheistic state. And the natural consequence of that is that that's unstable, because you can't have lots of people worshiping different gods and one day one of those gods will win. And because Islam is so assertive and strong, it will probably be the one that wins. So yes, multiculturalism. And the interesting thing about multiculturalism is it was advocated by politicians back in the 1990s, and then post 9/11 and post 7/7 here in London and various other things, politicians did distance themselves from it and say, no, this isn't what we want. But there are still other politicians and others who are advocating it. It was so strongly infused in our culture that we're multicultural, and you still get politicians saying we're multicultural, diversity is our strength, these kind of mantras, which are not helpful. And the British people, many of them are sick of that and fed up of it and don't want to hear it anymore, particularly as they've seen the fruit of it now, and the fruit of it is hard to disguise, which is why immigration has now become the biggest political issue in terms of people's voting intentions. And so politicians start to realise they can't just keep saying diversity is our strength and multiculturalism is good and so on, and they're starting to realise that people are not falling for this anymore. So yes, it's a challenge, but it requires some cultural shift to shift us back out of multiculturalism into wanting what we ought to have, which is a properly Christian culture, and what we did have 50 years ago plus.
If you don't mind, mention please the book that you mentioned a short while ago that came out about 3, 4 years ago about the Muslim neighborhoods
That's
and
called
the demographic.
Among the Mosques by Ed Hussein. Among the
That's
Mosques.
right, among the mosques. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, the title of the book is Among the Mosques, and I have read that book, and I recommend
Yeah.
to everyone to absolutely read that book because that's going to open your eyes concerning exactly what Tim was talking about, this so-called multiculturalism, which is nothing and nothing else but the establishment of two or three states within one state within one jurisdiction. I want to ask you about these Muslim neighborhoods. For the last 5 or 6 months or so, I have lived here in actually not lived but worked in Brussels on a various projects, and I'm seeing here in Brussels what they call no-go zones. By the way, uh, lots of anti-Semitic manifestations here in Brussels as well, of course, spearheaded by the Muslim population in Belgium, but also promoted by politicians, left-wing politicians as well, and a lot of vulgar signs and vulgar comments about Jews left and right that you can even see sometimes from time to time you can see on buildings and so on and so forth. But going back to this notion of multiculturalism, I was saying here in Brussels, and actually I've seen a study recently published by a French author. It's called No-Go Zones, a study about the so-called no-go zones in various cities in Europe. And folks, those of you who have not heard yet or do not know what no-go zones is, I will tell you. Maybe Mr. Dieppe can also pitch in as well. Those are zones in major metropolitan areas of Europe, such as Brussels, Amsterdam, Paris, Milan, and so on and so forth, where Muslims sort of live in their own world outside authorities, local authorities uh, do not go in. They don't want to have anything to do with that part of the city, either because of crime or because of customs imported from abroad, polygamy, social decay, so on and so forth. The police simply does not even go in. So, Tim, in light of this explanation, of course, you can add to this explanation definition I have given about the no-go zones. Do you have anything like that in the UK, in London, in some of the major metropolitan areas?
Well, I think there are some areas like that. There are areas in Dewsbury, for example, where all the major retailers have deserted the areas. There are no pubs; they've all closed down. There are no basically non-halal shops, and where you can walk up and down the streets, and the signs are all in Arabic, and the men are all dressed in Islamic garb, and the women are all dressed covered up, and so on. And it's very interesting because, like you say in this book, Among the Mosques, Ed Hussein, who is a moderate Muslim himself, says that in certain areas there are no-go zones for non-Muslims, and where people don't go there because they know they're not welcome there, and certainly at night time you wouldn't want to go there as a non-Muslim. So they're not sort of, there's no formal thing that says this. There's no necessarily signs, although there have occasionally been people who put up signs saying non-Muslims not welcome here. But that's not normal. Um, and there's no formal system like that. But everyone knows you don't go into that area. That's kind of how it is. And so yes, there are some places like that in Britain and in certain towns and certain places, and that's a shocking thing to admit and to realize that this is this kind of like a takeover of a culture by another culture in this way, and that certain areas have been completely taken over or changed into a completely different culture to what they used to be.
A related question would be what about Sharia law? I read here and there fragments, snippets that
Mm.
Sharia law is applied in these no-go zones, And I have also heard, maybe you can enlighten us on this subject as well. I've heard that in some cases, even courts in the UK apply Sharia law.
So there are informal Sharia courts in the UK. They're not backed by the government, but there are Sharia courts. Estimates, there's no record of them. There's no formal list of anything like that. The best estimate somebody's made some years ago now is 85 Sharia courts. There could well be over 100 plus Sharia courts, but nobody really knows. It's well known that people go to these courts to resolve disputes. In some cases, it's been found they resolve disputes that ought to be resolved by criminal courts in the UK. A lot of the time, it's divorce. So what happens is women a couple gets married in a mosque, but it's not registered in UK law. So they're not married in UK law. So then when the husband divorces them, as you just can say, I divorce you 3 times in Islam, or leaves them or dies, the woman has no legal rights under UK law, as she would as a wife, because she's not legally recognised as a wife because the marriage wasn't registered. So the only recourse she has is to go to a Sharia court, pay some money, and try and persuade the imams to do something for her. But under Sharia law, the men get custody of the children, not the women, and the woman's voice is worth half a man's voice in court, and men are permitted to beat their wives. And no one, one of these Sharia judges has been found to say no man should be asked why he hit his wife, and so on. So it's a very discriminatory system, and it creates a parallel legal system. There's a fuss earlier this year because an advert went up on a government website for a Sharia law administrator, I think it was, and this was for a Didsbury Mosque Sharia court in Didsbury, Manchester, and because it went on a government website, it looked like government was endorsing a Sharia law job working for a Sharia court. There were qualifications required, qualifications in Sharia law or experience in Sharia courts in some countries, and this is what's happening in the UK. We're creating a parallel legal system here in the UK. Some people aren't even aware of British justice and British courts and British law as they should be, and they think the only recourse is to go to Sharia courts, and there can be local pressure or peer pressure to not go to the police and not go to British legal system, and to instead try and resolve disputes through these community courts or Sharia courts that happen. And this is one of the fruits of multiculturalism and part of what's happening with the influence of Islam in the UK.
It certainly changes society, British society, and obviously, at least I do not see on the horizon this influence shrinking, but on the contrary, just expanding and expanding. What about polygamy? Talking
Yeah.
about no-go zones, I would imagine. I haven't seen any specific reports. I don't recall any. But what about polygamy in these no-go zones?
Well, I mean, yes, because if you have unregistered marriages, then there's nothing to prevent a Muslim marrying more than one wife, and Islam allows up to 4 wives, doesn't it? Um, so yes, there are. It's estimated something like 20,000 polygamous marriages in the UK, and where people have immigrated from other cultures, the government recognises multiple wives sometimes. So they have a kind of legal status in that case. We've proposed, and not the only ones to propose, but we've long supported a change in the law which would require Muslims to register their marriages and make it a criminal offence to have a religious marriage ceremony without registering it under the government, which is what's done in some Muslim countries like Pakistan. And in fact, it's illegal not to register a Church of England marriage in this country or a Jewish marriage in this country. But how come Muslim marriages don't fit into that? If you force marriages to be registered, then you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. A, you prevent polygamy, and B, you give the women the rights under law that they have if the husband divorces them, leaves them, or dies, which then undermines the business of Sharia courts and means they can seek justice in the British legal system. So that's, I think, an important policy step that could be done. It's been advocated by lots of people. The Council of Europe have said Britain should do it. The Law Society even said Britain should do it. But no politician has been prepared to back this provision at the moment.
Um, I think I heard you. If I'm inaccurate about what you said, please let me know. But I think I heard you say that if a Muslim, let's say from Pakistan or Egypt, where polygamy is allowed, has four
Yeah.
wives, he can bring four wives to the UK.
Yes, that has happened. Yeah, yeah,
Goodness gracious, incredible. What about the reaction of politicians to all of this mess, this social, in my opinion, social decay that's going on, social fragmentation
yes.
in the UK as a result of the massive influx of Muslims? Are the politicians catering to the Muslim vote? Are they? What's their
Well,
reaction?
this is the thing; it is affecting demographics, and I mentioned the Muslim vote earlier. Um, and the thing is, it took a huge portion of votes away from Labour, the Labour Party, um, which was formerly able to rely on the Muslim votes to vote for them, and now it can't or couldn't at the last election, and so they're desperate to try and appease the Muslim vote. Many Labour politicians are, and so they're not being critical of Islam. They're not prepared to do something that will inhibit Islam or restrict it, and that's a serious problem that we have in terms of politicians. The other problem we have is that um, there was a definition of Islamophobia that was proposed in 2018 by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims. All-Party Parliamentary Group is shorthand APPG. It's called the APPG definition, and the definition says that Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets Muslimness or expressions of Muslimness. There are many problems with this definition. First of all, Islam is not a race, so how can Islamophobia be racism? And secondly, it's about Muslimness, and nobody knows what that is, and that's not defined. And even if it was defined, it's perceived Muslimness that counts. So just somebody perceiving that you're being Islamophobic against somebody's Muslimness, by definition, makes you Islamophobic. So you could be accused of being Islamophobic for all sorts of things under this definition. But this definition has been adopted by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party and the Green Party and various other parties, which means that most of our politicians today are members of a political party that has adopted this APPG definition of Islamophobia as part of their code of conduct. It means that they know that if they say something Islamophobic, they could be suspended, disciplined, or expelled from their party. So they know that their job is on the line if they say something that is critical of Islam, that people say that's Islamophobic. So they won't. So yes, we have a serious problem with that, and now the government has recognised that that definition falls foul of the Equality Act for various reasons, partly because Islam is not a race. So they're desperate to propose some official definition of Islamophobia. So earlier this year, they set up a working group to do that. The working group, we now know, has proposed a definition of Islamophobia, but nobody knows what it is. It's very secret. They haven't told the public yet. We know that they have told certain activist groups and people, but they've not made it public. And we expect an announcement sometime next month or two saying this is the definition we're going to adopt, without any consultation with the public about what the definition is. And this could be a similarly bad definition in terms of restricting freedom of speech and the ability to criticise Islam. And that then makes it much harder for us to resist the growing growth of Islam because of the government adopting official definitions of Islamophobia that amounts to a kind of blasphemy code on all politicians and all people working for the government as well.
That was one topic I was going to cover with you, and that is freedom of speech. One of the things I feel a great deal of affection towards the British culture and tradition is this tremendous national psyche, if you will, which is anchored in freedom of speech. We have
Mm.
borrowed that from the British people in the United States. The United States population is very jealous when it comes to freedom of speech. And when we see these events happening or these trends, tendencies
Mm.
in the UK concerning freedom of speech, we sort of get worried, concerned, and we are asking ourselves what is going on. Uh,
Yes.
as somebody who practices in the area of civil rights in the United States as an attorney, in my mind, there should not even be the need for a definition of Islamophobia. It's not the government's job to
Yeah.
define freedom of speech. It's the court's job. It's not the
Yep.
government's job to define Islamophobia or anti-Christianity, whatever, or anti-Semitism.
I
It's for the
agree.
courts, it's for the public itself. So tell us, in addition to Islamophobia and the definition, in what other respects has freedom of speech been impacted adversely by Muslims and their actions? Self censorship, I would imagine, to some extent. Go ahead,
Oh,
please.
definitely. People are afraid. I mean, people are afraid to speak out about Islam, um, and have been for a long time. Unjustifiably, really, because very few people actually get attacked for what they say about Islam. But people are afraid and they self-censor. Definitely, we've also had street preachers who've been arrested. A lot of street preachers have been arrested. In fact, this week we publicised a case of a street preacher called Sean O'Sullivan, who literally said, "We love the Jews and we love the Palestinians," when preaching to a group of pro-Palestinian protesters, and he was arrested and charged for a criminal offence for saying those words. Like, because saying "we love the Jews" to that group of people is too offensive for them, apparently. And it's crazy. Now, the jury throughout the case, so he wasn't convicted, as he should never have been. But he should never have been arrested, and even if he was arrested, he shouldn't have ever been prosecuted for saying anything like that. So it's crazy that it's got to this, and the police are knocking on people's doors and sometimes arresting people for what they say on social media, even about Islam sometimes. And furthermore, we've had lots of other examples of street preachers. One famous example is Hatun Tash, who's a quite well-known and provocative evangelist. She is very provocative. She wears T-shirts with cartoons of Muhammad on it. She has a copy of the Quran with holes drilled through it to remind Muslims about a famous scholar saying there are holes in the narrative of how the Quran came to be. But she's also very successful. She's seen over 1,000 converts from Islam to Christianity, and many, many imams converting from Islam to Christianity. But she's been assaulted and beaten and knocked to the ground, had her glasses broken, had things stolen from her when she preaches in Hyde Park Corner here in London. And none of the people who've done that to have ever been arrested, but she has been arrested because the police find it easier to arrest her than to try and tell the mob to stop harassing her and assaulting her and insulting her. And so she's been arrested for not doing any crime, and twice now Christian Concern have helped her to obtain compensation from the police for wrongful arrest, and compensation of £10,000 each time, because the police are not justified in arresting her. But the problem is that's what they continue to do, because it's easier to do that than to try and confront the mob. So, which means we're kind of submitting to and endorsing mob rule effectively when you do that. So yes, it's a real issue, free speech. But the biggest threat is really the government defining Islamophobia and where we end up with that, and how that will impact lots of people in terms of the possibility of losing their jobs for being Islamophobic according to that definition, whatever it is says.
I'm glad that you mentioned the case of Hatun Tash. That's a formidable street preacher in the UK, a convert from Muslim, actually a lady,
Hmm.
tough lady, who I think she's from Turkey, and she converted to Christianity some years ago, and now she's preaching the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ in public in London. I think
Hmm.
that in London there's like a special place.
Yes, there's a
I
place
forgot
called
the name.
Speaker's Corner or Hyde Park Corner, which has been a place of free speech and designated with special laws protecting free speech in that place. And famous people have preached there. Billy Graham's preached there, and various other famous politicians have preached there. And every Sunday afternoon there are debates and discussions there. Nowadays, the debates and discussions are largely about Islam, because there's a lot of Muslims there who go there to debate and discuss. But more and more Christians now are also going there and challenging them and confronting them. And you can watch people like Bob of Speaker's Corner. You go on his YouTube channel and watch some of his stuff, and some other people as well who go there and do that. And the Christians are getting good at it. But Hattab has been assaulted. She was actually stabbed a few years back now, and the stabbing very narrowly missed her major artery in her neck, so it's clearly intended to kill her. And there was a recent case as well of another street preacher who was assaulted by a knifed Muslim man in Hyde Park Corner. So it's becoming sadly more dangerous.
And there have also been cases of preachers and pastors from the United States who actually went all the way to London and other cities in the UK, preaching the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and speaking against LGBTQ issues, matters against sodomy, homosexuality, so on and so forth. They have
Yeah.
also been arrested in the UK, and then at some point they've been released. But again, we are concerned about what's going on in the UK with freedom of speech, especially considering that for many, many centuries the UK has been a beacon for the rest of the world when it came to freedom, individual freedom, and more particularly freedom of speech. I've got maybe the final question that I have for you, team, and then of course we can get into other topics. You are free to continue as well. But I want to ask you about the reaction of the public, of the UK public, to all of these issues. Of course, we have only touched the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other issues concerning Islam in the UK, and I know that the British people are very, very tolerant, very, very patient. They endure a lot. They don't really complain a lot. But there comes a point where enough is enough, and I'm wondering whether or not the people of Great Britain have reached that point. They are seeing these changes, social changes, political changes, economic changes, double standards in politicians. Have they had enough? What can you tell us?
Certainly, more and more people are saying enough is enough now. And like I said, immigration is now the number one political issue in the country, and that's recognised by politicians. And that is part of a reaction to this whole thing. More and more people are looking at the culture, saying, "How do we allow Islam to have this much power, and how do we allow Islam to take over churches?" In some cases, we've mentioned that, and all the grooming gang stuff. We've mentioned that as well. And we've got so many illegal migrants that we have to pay for them to be housed in hotels. And then there are increased sexual offences outside these hotels sometimes, and therefore massive protests against them by the local communities saying, "Why are we housing these people here?" And the politicians, even the Labour Party, are starting to recognise this. Starmer is the most unpopular Prime Minister ever, according to polling. And so, and Reform, a new political party, is very popular at the moment. The Conservatives, of course, have been in power for 14 years and not really tackled this and not really engaged with it. And so they've lost the trust of the British people, and Labour now are losing the trust as well, as they're in power and not really able to do anything about it or have the willingness to do anything about it. So I think there is, and you've seen big protests. There's a massive march called the Unite the Kingdom rally in September, led by a well-known chap called Tommy Robinson, and lots of people carrying Christian symbols at that march, because I think they even if they're not Christians, they sort of recognise that there's a spiritual dimension here, and that we've created a spiritual vacuum which Islam has walked into, and the only way out of that is to get back to Christianity. And people I know that were there say that the people on the march were very open to Christianity and very open to the gospel, more open than they've seen in any other context in the UK. And there's mention of a quiet revival of people, and it's particularly young men who are slightly more conservative, politically leaning, who are searching for Christians, who's searching for Christianity, searching for truth, wanting to learn about the Bible, thinking, gosh, Islam is strong. What about Christianity? Let's understand that better. And going to church. Or we had someone phone up our office just last week saying, "I googled Christianity, Christians opposed to Islam, and Christian Concern came up. What church should I go to?" So this kind of thing is happening, and we've got 4 more years of this Labour government, but it'll be very interesting to see what happens at the next election, because both Labour and Conservatives are very unpopular. Reform is popular. On the left-hand side, you've got the Greens, but you've also got the prospect of potentially a new political party, Islamic Party, arising. We'll see whether that happens or not. So interesting times that we live in, but I think there is a sense in which the patience of the people is running short, and we'll see where that leads depending what happens. Imagine if you had a big terrorist attack, how that would affect the nation, and you never know when something like that might happen. So the terrorist threat level in the UK is something like likely at the moment. So something could happen, another big story could happen, and the culture will respond, and people get more upset about it. So we'll see.
I'm glad you mentioned some of the encouraging signs because indeed I was in London for a couple of days in September, and I did hear people talk about this quiet Christian revival to some extent, if you can name it that, if you can call it that way, among the younger population,
Yeah,
young British population, interested, quote, in the faith of their forefathers, to rediscover Christianity, which is a great sign, a good sign. And I have also noticed, and I have asked someone, and maybe you can give us an explanation about this phenomenon as well in the UK. I've seen a lot of flags on buildings, businesses in London, um, and I was told that
again, this
was
is a
the
reaction.
back
I think it's died down now. But there
St.
was
George.
there was a period of time when there was lots of George Cross, which is the English flag, being put up on lampposts and places around towns. And it's in my mind, it's a reaction against. We've seen so many Palestinian flags since
Right.
the October the 7th attacks, and then also for many years so many LGBT flags flying around, and often sponsored by local authorities, local governments to do that, and on prominent buildings and shops and banks and institutions, all this kind of thing, and mayor and local council buildings, even prisons have these flags. And and I think this is part of a reaction against that, is to say, come on, let's have our flag, let's get our nation back, let's get back to that kind of thing that's going on there. And I sympathise with that. And I think that's part of what was going on there. I think that's sort of died down now, but it shows the cultural issue that people are thinking we're losing our culture, we need to get it back. And flags are very symbolic. They're
Right.
very symbolic of what the culture values. And the government was opposed to people flying the British flag or the English flag, which says a lot about the culture. It says a lot about the culture, whereas they never complained about the LGBT flags or the Palestinian flags being flown up and down the country. So this is a kind of reaction to that, I think, that was going on there.
Tim, we would like to thank you again very much for the time that you have allocated for this podcast. If there is anything else to add, we can spend another half an hour listening to you. I mean, you are incredible. You have so much, you possess so much information that's useful and educational for all of us. If there is anything else that you wanted to say on this podcast that maybe I didn't ask, please take the freedom and put it out there.
Well, maybe it's worth talking about grooming gangs for a little bit, because we did repeat with
Yes, please.
grooming gangs. The grooming gang issue has been going on for 40 years plus, where largely Islamic gangs have been abducting and raping young girls of mostly white, sometimes Sikh girls in this country. And it's become a massive political issue, not least because Elon Musk tweeted about it earlier this year. And that put international political pressure and raised the profile of this whole issue. And Elon Musk is asking, why has this been allowed to happen? Who's let this happen? And the fact is that people have been so afraid of being called racist or Islamophobic that they've not tackled this. And they've not, and there've been cases where the police have been told, stop going after these Pakistani rapists, find some white rapists to go after, those will be called racist. And when these Pakistanis are doing awful rapes, multiple rapes, gang rapes, and so on of women, and in single towns there have been over 1,000 victims, and it's now found to have been taking place in over 80 towns up and down the country. So it could easily be like 80,000 victims, and the victims have often been raped hundreds of times. So you could easily get it to 1 million rapes that's happened over this whole thing. We published a report just the other week into UK grooming gangs and Islam, written by a respected Islamic academic scholar called Dr. Mark Jury, who's based in Australia. I'd encourage you to read that report. It says Islam is more significant factor in these grooming gangs than ethnicity, because people are calling them Asian gangs or Pakistani gangs, but actually there are it's not fair on all the Asians. I mean, there are no Chinese gangs, there are no Hong Kong gangs, and it's not fair even on Pakistanis either, because there are also other ethnicities involved, like Somalian. But the main unifying factor is actually religion, and this report shows there are 8 Islamic doctrines that have been used to justify or support the activities of these grooming gangs. So that's a major report that we've released, and it's a very important issue. And the government, under pressure because of partly Elon Musk, this year did commit to doing a national inquiry into these grooming gangs, reluctantly, having resisted it for some time, and then they failed to get this national inquiry off the ground, and the victims, some of them, resigned from the panel, complaining that the national inquiry was trying to water down what they were looking into, and complaining in particular that it wasn't going to include religion in what they were going to assess in this inquiry. And so this report should hopefully support the victims and show people that Islam that is a major factor and therefore does need to be investigated, and people need to properly assess that as part of this national inquiry, which I hope they do get off the ground at some point, properly, with a proper person involved, and that what the victims are asking for is for it to be a judge. And I think that will be the only solution now. So I hope they find a judge who's willing to do it, who's got the guts and the strength of character and resolve to do it, and we have a proper national inquiry, because so far no police officers have ever been disciplined for not properly tackling these things. And unless we see that, I think we won't see a proper change of culture in the police, which is partly what's allowed this whole thing to happen.
Tim, we thank you again for being our guest on this podcast tonight. And I also would like to thank very much Janina in Romania for taking care of the logistical aspects of this podcast. Folks, we have had a fantastic, phenomenal conversation on a very important topic. The author of the book, The Challenge of Islam in the UK, has been with us tonight. We thank him again. Tim, thank you. May the Lord bless you. And
thank you. Thank you. It's been great conversation.
We invite you to Romania, and we'll stay in touch by email and phone.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Good night. Bye.
Thank you.